The security guard didn't even try to hide the way his eyes dragged over me, slow and dismissive, like he was inventorying something already marked for disposal. The glass doors behind him reflected a version of the party I hadn't entered yet. Warm lights, polished marble men in tailored suits laughing too loudly. I stood on the other side of that reflection, in a simple dress and flat shoes, holding a small envelope with my sister's name written carefully across the front. "Invitation," he asked, already smirking. "I'm here for my sister's engagement," I said. My voice was calm, practiced. He glanced at the clipboard in his hand, then back at me. "Staff entrance is around the corner," he said, pointing without looking. "Deliveries don't come through here." For a second I thought I'd misheard him. Then I saw her, my sister, through the glass, laughing with her future in-laws. Our eyes met, just for a heartbeat. Her smile faltered. Then she turned away, pretending not to recognize me. The guard cleared his throat. "You're blocking the entrance." Something settled in my chest then. Not anger, not humiliation, recognition. This wasn't confusion. It was a choice. I nodded. Once thanked him and walked toward the service corridor, my footsteps echoing down a narrower, dimmer hall. They thought this was where my night would end. They were wrong. The air changed as soon as I passed through the service door. The music dulled, replaced by the hum of machinery and hurried voices. The floor lost its shine. The walls were practical scuffed, lined with cables and handwritten notices taped at crooked angles. No one asked me who I was or why I was there. People moved past me with purpose, carrying trays, adjusting earpieces, muttering into phones. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. I'd learned a long time ago that power didn't announce itself. It observed, it listened, it waited. I hadn't come tonight to make a scene. I hadn't come to prove anything. I'd come because my sister was getting engaged, and because no matter how distant we'd grown, family still mattered to me, even when it forgot that I did. A young woman rushed past me, nearly colliding with my shoulder. "Sorry," she said breathlessly, already moving on. Behind her, two men argued in hushed voices about a timing issue, their words overlapping in frustration. Someone swore under their breath. Someone else laughed nervously. "Tonight is a mess," a voice muttered near the storage racks. I paused, filing that away. I adjusted the strap of my bag and continued down the corridor, following the flow until it opened into a shared space just off the main hall. From here, I could hear the party more clearly, the clink of glasses, the swell of music, the artificial brightness of celebration. I could also see my parents standing near a column, smiling stiffly, their shoulders tight. I hesitated before stepping closer. My mother spotted me first. Her expression flickered, relief-worry calculation, all in the space of a second. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "You made it," she said as if surprised. "Good. Just try not to cause any problems tonight, okay?" I looked at her, searching for something softer beneath the words. "Problems?" I asked. She sighed, already glancing past me toward the crowd. "You know what I mean. This is important for your sister. Important." The word carried weight in my family. It always had. Important things weren't questioned. They weren't disrupted. They were endured. My father nodded in agreement, offering me a tight smile. "Just stay nearby," he added. Out of the way, again. I didn't argue. I never did, not in moments like this. Arguing required an audience willing to listen. I found my sister near the center of the room a few minutes later. She looked radiant in a way that felt practiced hair, perfect posture, rehearsed smile, calibrated for approval. When she noticed me approaching, her expression shifted, smoothing into something polite and distant. "I'm glad you came," she said, touching my arm lightly. Her grip didn't linger. "But maybe it's better if you stay." Toward the back. "Tonight's a lot, I repeated. She nodded, eyes darting toward her future in-laws. "They're very particular. I just don't want anything to distract from the evening." I studied her face, the tension beneath the makeup. She wasn't cruel. She was afraid. Afraid of losing the place she thought she'd earned. Afraid of being pulled back into a version of herself she'd worked so hard to escape. "I understand," I said. Relief washed over her features. She squeezed my hand once before turning away, already pulled back into the orbit of other people's expectations. That was when I met them. Her fiancé's parents greeted me with warm smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. They asked my name, what I did, where I lived, questions delivered quickly, answers barely registered. I watched their attention drift as soon as I finished speaking, their expressions settling into something dismissive, satisfied, categorized, dismissed. Around us, the room operated on an invisible hierarchy. Some guests were drawn into conversations effortlessly. Others hovered at the edges, waiting to be acknowledged. I could see who mattered here and who didn't by the way people leaned in or away. This wasn't just an engagement party. It was a performance, a demonstration of status, of access, of belonging. I felt it then clearly, the stakes. If I spoke out of turn, I'd embarrass my sister. If I challenged anyone openly, I'd be painted as bitter, disruptive, jealous. And if I stayed silent, I'd be invisible. Silence had always been my refuge, but it had also been my armor. I drifted back toward the edge of the room, closer to the service corridor than the dance floor. From here, I could see both worlds at once, the polished front and the strained machinery behind it. I watched staff members move with forced efficiency, watched managers whisper urgently into phones, watched small cracks form beneath the surface of perfection. A man in a headset argued with someone off to the side, his voice tight. A server froze when a last-minute instruction was barked at her, panic flickering across her face before she nodded and rushed away. Something wasn't right. I leaned against the wall, unnoticed, listening. It would have been easy to leave then, to slip back out through the service entrance and let the night unfold without me. No one would have stopped me. No one would have blamed me. But I stayed, because I could already see where this was headed, because I knew what happened when pressure met pretense, and because once you noticed the cracks, you couldn't unsee them. I hadn't stepped into the spotlight, not yet. But the night had already begun to shift, and somewhere beneath the music and the smiles, something was about to break. I stayed near the edge of the room long enough to understand the rules. Who spoke first? Who interrupted without apology? Who waited smiling too long, hoping to be noticed? The hierarchy revealed itself quickly once I stopped looking for warmth and started looking for patterns. My parents stood a few feet away, angled toward my sister's future in-laws, like satellites pulled into a stronger orbit. They laughed a little too eagerly at jokes that weren't funny. My mother kept smoothing the front of her jacket, a nervous habit she'd never quite broken. My father nodded along, hands folded behind his back, posture rigid as if standing at attention might earn him approval by proximity. I approached them slowly, not because I was afraid of the conversation, but because I already knew how it would go. "You found your seat?" my father asked, glancing past me as if expecting someone more important to appear at any second. "I'm standing," I said. My mother's smile tightened. "That's fine. Just stay close, okay? We don't want anyone thinking we're disorganized." Disorganized. Another word that carried history. In our family, disorganized meant embarrassing. It meant failure without a paycheck. It meant being the wrong version of yourself in front of the wrong people. "I won't cause a scene," I said quietly. My mother relaxed just a little. "Good," she replied, as if that was all she needed from me. There was no question about how I was doing, no acknowledgement of the fact that I'd been sent around the building like a delivery person. That part of the evening had already been mentally erased. It didn't fit the story they needed tonight. I let it go. I'd spent years learning when to push and when to step back. This wasn't a moment that could bear weight. Not yet. My sister drifted back toward us, radiant and tense all at once. Up close, I could see the fine cracks beneath the polish, the way her smile faltered when conversations lagged, the way her eyes kept darting toward her fiancé's parents for cues. "You're okay?" I asked softly. She nodded too quickly. "Yes. It's just a lot. Everyone's watching. They always are," I said. She hesitated, then leaned closer. "Listen," she murmured, keeping her smile fixed for anyone who might be looking. "Maybe stay near the back for a bit, just until things settle." There it was. Not unkind, not cruel, just careful. She wasn't asking me to leave. She was asking me to make myself smaller. "I understand," I said again. Her shoulders loosened, relief flickering across her face before she turned back toward the crowd, pulled away by another congratulatory embrace. I watched her go, a familiar ache settling in my chest. We hadn't always been like this. There had been a time when we shared secrets late at night, when she trusted me with her fears, instead of hiding them behind ambition. Somewhere along the way, she'd decided that becoming someone else was safer than being herself. And I'd let her. A voice interrupted my thoughts. "And you are a woman," asked brightly. I turned to find my sister's future mother-in-law standing far too close. Her smile practiced her eyes sharp. She held a champagne flute delicately, fingers barely touching the glass. "I'm her sister," I said. "Ah," she replied, nodding. "Of course. How lovely." Her gaze flicked over me again, lingering just long enough to make the assessment clear. "And what do you do?" I answered honestly. I always did. She smiled politely, then turned to greet someone else before I'd even finished speaking. The conversation ended not with dismissal, but with indifference, which somehow felt worse. I was no longer worth her time. That, too, was a choice. I stepped away, weaving through clusters of guests, listening more than speaking. Conversations overlapped career trajectories, strategic moves, people who knew people who could open doors. Names were dropped casually like currency. Laughter followed every reference to influence, every implication of access. This wasn't celebration. It was positioning. I noticed how often my sister's future in-laws used the word "we" when talking about decisions, and how rarely anyone questioned it. I noticed how staff members stiffened when they passed by that particular group, how instructions flowed outward from them without ever being formally given. Borrowed authority was still authority, at least for now. A server brushed past me, her hands shaking slightly as she balanced a tray. She caught my eye for half a second, something like apology or exhaustion flashing across her face. I gave her a small nod, an acknowledgement she didn't expect. Her shoulders eased just a fraction before she disappeared into the crowd. I drifted back toward the service corridor, needing space to think. Behind the scenes, the contrast was stark. The laughter vanished, the tension sharpened. People spoke quickly clipped sentences full of urgency. A man in a wrinkled suit paced near a clipboard, muttering into his phone. Another woman stared at a tablet, frowning. I leaned against the wall, unnoticed, listening. "They changed the timing again," someone said. "That's not possible," another voice snapped. "We already adjusted." "Well, they want it done. Figure it out." They, always they. I followed the sound of raised voices to a small, open area near the technical station. Two coordinators were arguing quietly, one rubbing her temples, the other flipping through schedules with growing panic. "If this goes wrong, it's on us," the first said. "It shouldn't be," the second replied. "This isn't our call." But it would be. I knew how this worked. Pressure rolled downhill. Responsibility stuck to whoever couldn't afford to push back. I stepped closer, not inserting myself, just observing. Patterns formed quickly when you knew what to look for. Last-minute changes, unrealistic demands, no margin for error. This wasn't incompetence. It was control exercised without accountability. A familiar feeling stirred, one I'd learned to recognize. The quiet awareness that something was heading toward a breaking point. I returned to the main hall just in time to see my sister being pulled into another conversation, her smile strained. Her fiancé stood beside her, nodding dutifully, eyes flicking nervously between his parents and the crowd. He looked overwhelmed but compliant. A man trained to follow expectations, not challenge them. My parents hovered nearby, careful not to intrude, careful not to disappear. I caught my mother's eye. For a moment, something like doubt flickered there. Then she looked away. The night pressed forward, momentum building. Glasses were refilled. Music swelled. The room felt tighter, as if everyone were leaning toward a moment no one wanted to name. I stood still, absorbing it all. I could have spoken up then. Could have warned someone. Could have drawn attention to the strain, the misalignment, the inevitable fallout. But warnings without authority were just noise, and noise would only make things worse. So I stayed quiet. Because silence, when chosen deliberately, wasn't weakness. It was restraint. And because sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was let people reveal exactly who they were without interruption. By the time the first formal announcement was about to begin, I knew two things with absolute certainty. This night mattered far more than anyone in my family realized, and whatever happened next would force every single person in that room to choose where they stood, including me. I slipped back through the service corridor before anyone noticed I was gone. The transition was immediate and jarring, like stepping through a thin wall between two realities. The music faded to a dull throb, replaced by the low hum of ventilation, and the clipped urgency of voices that didn't have time for pleasantries. Back here, no one cared who you were. They cared what you could fix. A man with a headset hurried past me, fingers flying over his phone. Two servers argued in whispers near a prep table, their faces tight with stress. Somewhere down the hall, something metallic clanged, followed by a curse. The smell of cleaning solution mixed with warm food and overheated electronics hung in the air. I slowed my pace, letting the chaos move around me. I'd seen environments like this before, places held together by deadlines and denial, where every problem was manageable until suddenly it wasn't. The signs were always the same: too many last-minute changes, too many people afraid to say no, too much reliance on appearances instead of systems. I stopped near a cluster of staff huddled around a workstation. A tablet lay flat on the counter, its screen filled with color-coded schedules that no longer lined up. "That doesn't work," a woman said, rubbing her forehead. "If we move, that it pushes everything else." "They don't care," another replied bitterly. "They just want it done." A young man stood slightly apart from the group, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked barely old enough to be here, his badge still stiff and new against his jacket. He caught my eye and hesitated, as if deciding whether to speak. "They changed the sequence again," he said quietly. "Not to anyone in particular. 5 minutes ago, who did someone snapped?" He swallowed. "The family, through their liaison." A ripple of frustration passed through the group. "That's not safe," the woman with the tablet said. "We can't compress it like that." "We don't have a choice," another voice muttered. I watched the exchange, my mind already mapping the structure beneath it. Decisions being handed down without understanding the consequences. Middle managers forced to absorb risk they didn't create. Staff caught between professionalism and fear. The young man noticed my silence and mistook it for judgment. I tried to explain, he said quickly, his voice tight. I really did. But they wouldn't listen. "I believe you," I said. He looked at me surprised. "You do?" I nodded. "This isn't your mistake." Something in his shoulders loosened at that just a fraction. It was a small thing, but small things mattered in moments like this. "What exactly did they change?" I asked. The woman glanced at me, suspicion flickering across her face. "Who are you?" "Someone who's listening," I replied. She studied me for a second longer, then sighed. "They want to move the announcement forward and cut the buffer. No adjustment time. No contingency. That affects the technical reset," the young man added. "If anything goes wrong, there's no margin." "And if something does go wrong?" I asked. She gave a humorless laugh. "Guess who gets blamed?" I didn't need to ask. I already knew. I leaned closer to the tablet, scanning the schedule. The problem wasn't just the timing. It was the accumulation of compromises layered on top of one another, each one survivable on its own, all of them together a recipe for failure. "How long until they expect this to happen?" I asked. 20 minutes, the woman said. "Maybe less." I exhaled slowly. In the front of the house, 20 minutes was a glass of champagne and polite laughter. Back here it was a countdown. "Who's authorized to approve changes to this sequence?" I asked. The woman hesitated. "Technically, senior operations. But they won't contradict the family," I finished. She didn't argue. I straightened. "What if you don't compress it?" I asked. Her eyes widened. "We can't just ignore them." "No," I said calmly. "You can't. But you can frame it differently." They stared at me. "Restore the original buffer." I continued. "Shift the visible elements, not the technical ones. Buy yourselves time without making it obvious." That would require, the young man started then stopped as he thought it through. "It might work. It will," I said, "if you reroute the signal check and stagger the cues." The woman blinked. "You sound very sure." "I am." She searched my face for a moment, then looked back at the tablet. Her fingers hovered over the screen, indecision written into every line of her posture. "If we do this without approval, and it goes wrong," she began. "It won't," I said. "And if they find out," the young man asked. I met his gaze. "Then the question won't be who messed up. It'll be who prevented something worse." Silence stretched between us, heavy and uncertain. Finally, the woman made a decision. "Okay," she said. "We'll try it." The atmosphere shifted immediately. Movement replaced paralysis. Instructions were whispered, then repeated. The young man moved quickly, confidence replacing fear as he relayed updates into his headset. I stepped back, letting them work. A few minutes later, a man in a tailored suit approached, his expression tight with irritation. He looked out of place back here, too polished for the scuffed floors and exposed wiring. "Who authorized this?" he demanded, glancing between the tablet and the staff. The woman stiffened. "We're adjusting to maintain safety margins." That wasn't the instruction, he snapped. I met his eyes before she could respond. "It's the correct call," I said evenly. He turned to me, clearly annoyed. "And you are someone who understands what happens if this fails," I replied. He opened his mouth to argue, then paused. Something in my tone must have registered because his expression shifted from irritation to calculation. "Do you have clearance for this?" he asked. I held his gaze. Enough. It wasn't a lie, not exactly. He studied me for a long moment, then looked back at the tablet. The numbers were already changing, the system responding smoothly. No alarms, no errors. He exhaled sharply. "Fine," he muttered. "But if this causes a delay, it won't," I said again. He walked away without another word. The young man let out a breath he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said quietly. I nodded. "You did the right thing." As the tension eased, I became aware of the eyes on me. Staff members who hadn't noticed me before were now watching, curiosity replacing indifference. A woman I didn't recognize frowned slightly, as if trying to place my face. "You've done this before," she said. "Yes," I replied. "Here," she asked. "No." She seemed about to press further, then thought better of it. I checked my watch. Time had been bought but not solved. The front of the house would continue its performance, unaware of how close it had come to unraveling. For now. I turned away from the workstation and walked down the corridor, my thoughts already moving ahead. The intervention had been small, contained, but it had changed something fundamental. Lines had been crossed. Attention had been drawn. Once you stepped behind the curtain, you didn't get to pretend you hadn't seen how the machine worked. I stopped near a door marked "Staff Only" and rested my hand briefly against the cool metal. Somewhere beyond it, my sister smiled for cameras and compliments, unaware of how fragile the night truly was. I straightened and continued forward. I was no longer just observing, and I had a feeling the system knew it too. The chaos didn't return the way I expected it to. Instead of another wave of shouting or frantic movement, the space behind the scenes grew unnervingly quiet. Not calm, just restrained, like everyone was waiting to see who would make the next move. People began to look at me differently. Not openly, not yet. But I noticed the pauses before decisions, the glances in my direction when a question had no clear answer. A headset crackled, and a coordinator hesitated, eyes flicking toward me before she spoke. The system, fragile as it was, had adjusted its center of gravity. I hadn't meant for that to happen. But systems rarely ask permission. I moved slowly through the corridor, giving myself time to listen. Conversations stopped when I passed, then resumed in lower tones. A few minutes earlier, I'd been invisible. Now I was an unknown variable, and that made people uneasy. A man stepped into my path near the loading bay. He wore a pressed blazer that didn't belong back here, his badge clipped neatly to his pocket. Middle management, I guessed. The kind of person who enforced rules without ever writing them. "Can I help you?" he asked, his smile polite but brittle. "I'm fine," I replied. He didn't move. "We're trying to keep unauthorized personnel out of restricted areas." I met his eyes. "Then you should talk to the people issuing contradictory instructions." His smile faltered. "Excuse me, the schedule," I said, calmly. "The last-minute changes. They're coming from the front, not from operations." He studied my face, reassessing. "And you know this, how—" "Because I've been watching," I said. For a moment it looked like he might push harder. Then someone called his name from down the hall and he hesitated, weighing his options. Finally, he stepped aside. "Just don't interfere," he said. I nodded and continued past him. Interfere, another word people used when they wanted results without responsibility. Near the technical station, the woman with the tablet was speaking quietly into her headset, her voice steadier now. When she saw me, she lifted her chin slightly in acknowledgement. No gratitude, no deference, just recognition. It was enough. I leaned against the wall, letting the flow of information reach me without forcing it. Orders were still coming in from the front, but they were slower now, less confident. Questions were being asked where there hadn't been any before. Someone was losing control. A door opened behind me and a man I hadn't seen yet stepped out. Older, composed, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. He watched the room for a moment before his gaze settled on me. "You're not on my roster," he said. "I'm aware," I replied. A faint smile touched his lips. "You adjusted the buffer." "Yes." "And prevented a failure," he added. "I prevented a cascade," I corrected. "Failure would have been cleaner." He considered that. "You speak like someone who's done this at scale." "I have," I said. Silence stretched between us. Not uncomfortable, just deliberate. "Who sent you?" he asked finally. "No one," I said. "I was already here." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in interest. "You're not worried about stepping on toes. I'm worried about what happens when people with borrowed authority push systems they don't understand," I said. That earned me a quiet chuckle. Fair. He glanced toward the front of the building. "They've been making demands all evening." "I know. And you think that ends well?" "No," I said. "I think it ends loudly unless someone limits the damage." He studied me for another moment, then nodded once. "I won't ask who you are," he said. "But if you're going to keep intervening, be precise." "I intend to be." He turned and disappeared back through the door, leaving behind the distinct impression that a line had just been drawn and not against me. The requests from the front escalated shortly after, not in volume, but in tone, the kind of sharp urgency that came from people realizing they were being slowed down. A runner arrived breathless. "They want confirmation," she said. "Now, on what the tablet woman asked, on whether the sequence is locked." The woman looked at me without thinking. It was instinctive, uncalculated. She caught herself a second later, but the moment had already passed. "It is," I said. "For a reason." The runner hesitated. "I need to tell them something." "Tell them it's being reviewed," I replied. "And that rushing it increases exposure." "Exposure to what she asked. Everything I said." She nodded and hurried off. That was when I felt it, the subtle shift of attention from irritation to suspicion. People don't like it when obstacles don't move. They like it even less when those obstacles don't explain themselves. I checked my phone not for messages, but for timing. The night was reaching the point where performances collided with reality, where pressure made people careless. Voices rose near the corridor entrance. I recognized the cadence before I saw the faces. My sister's future in-laws, flanked by their liaison, swept in with an air of offended entitlement. "What's taking so long?" the woman demanded. We were very clear about our expectations. The liaison tried to placate her. "They're ensuring everything runs smoothly." "I don't care how smooth it is," she snapped. "I care that it happens when we said it would." The older man from before stepped forward. "There are safety and operational considerations." She waved him off. "This is our event. We're not asking." I felt the weight of the moment settle. This was it. The point where authority was tested not by competence, but by refusal. I stepped forward before anyone else could. "Rushing. This creates unnecessary risk," I said. Her head snapped toward me. "Who are you?" "Someone preventing a problem," I replied. She scoffed. "You don't have the authority to delay anything." I met her gaze. Authority isn't always visible. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening us?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm explaining the outcome." For a second it looked like she might explode. Then her husband placed a hand on her arm, murmuring something I couldn't hear. She straightened lips pressed thin. "This isn't over," she said, before turning sharply and walking away. The silence she left behind was thick. The liaison lingered, looking shaken. "You just made things worse," he whispered. No, I said. I made them honest. He stared at me, then shook his head and followed after them. Around us, the staff resumed moving, but the energy had changed. The fear was still there, but it was mixed now with something else. Expectation. A woman I hadn't noticed before leaned toward me. They're asking about you, she said quietly. I expected that, I replied. They want to know who's interfering. Then they'll find out. I'm not, I said. She frowned. What does that mean? It means I'm not interfering, I said. I'm correcting. She watched me for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if deciding something. They won't like that. I know. As I turned away, I felt it clearly then. The borrowed power of people used to being obeyed had finally met resistance. Not loud, not dramatic, just immovable. And that scared them far more than confrontation ever could, because the people with borrowed power had started to notice the person with real control, and they were already too late to stop what came next. Something was wrong long before anyone said it out loud. You could feel it in the way conversations clipped short, in the way smiles stayed frozen a second too long. The music still played, the lights still glowed, but the rhythm underneath it all had shifted like a machine running slightly out of sync. I stepped back into the main hall and immediately sensed the tension. Servers moved faster, eyes darting. A coordinator whispered urgently into a headset near the stage. Guests laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that filled space rather than celebrated anything. The engagement party was cracking. At first it was subtle. A microphone squealed during a welcome announcement, feedback ripping through the room before cutting out abruptly. The speaker froze blinking, then laughed it off, while the audience offered polite applause. A technician scrambled behind the scenes, face flushed. Nodding apologies no one cared to hear. My sister stood nearby, hands clasped tightly in front of her, her smile faltering just enough for me to notice. She glanced toward her future in-laws, searching for reassurance, and found none. Her future mother-in-law leaned toward a guest instead, whispering something sharp, her expression pinched with irritation. The next problem came faster. A presentation meant to introduce the families flickered onto the screen behind the stage. Instead of the carefully curated images, a half-loaded slide appeared unfinished raw. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone cut the feed, plunging the wall into blank darkness. This time the laughter didn't come. A man in a dark suit stepped forward, voice raised just enough to be heard. "What is going on?" he demanded. A young staff member hurried up, cheeks burning. "We're fixing it now, sir. That's not acceptable," he snapped. This was supposed to be seamless. I recognized the tactic immediately. Control through humiliation. Establish dominance by finding a target small enough to crush publicly. My sister's future mother-in-law joined him, her voice sharp and precise. "Do you have any idea how unprofessional this looks?" The staff member opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't make it worse. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, resolve. The coordinator from earlier rushed forward, trying to defuse the situation. "We've had several last-minute changes," she said carefully. "We're doing everything we can." "Excuses," the woman replied. "If you can't handle a simple timeline, you shouldn't be here." The staff member's eyes glistened. She nodded quickly, backing away as if shrinking might make her invisible. I watched the exchange closely. This wasn't frustration. This was deliberate. Every mistake, no matter how small, was being amplified, weaponized. The message was clear. Power resided at the front, blame flowed backward. I took a step forward. "Publicly dressing down staff doesn't solve technical issues," I said evenly. The room stilled just for a heartbeat. Her head turned toward me slowly. "Excuse me. It increases the chance of another error," I continued. "People make better decisions when they're not panicking." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. The coordinator looked at me with something like gratitude mixed with fear. "And who are you?" the woman asked. "Someone who doesn't want this to spiral," I replied. She laughed sharply. "This is not your place." I met her gaze. "Then neither is the blame." Her smile vanished. "I suggest you stop inserting yourself into matters you don't understand." I held my ground. I understand enough. There was a murmur in the crowd now. Not agreement, but curiosity. The worst thing for people like her wasn't opposition. It was uncertainty. She turned away with a huff, dismissing me, as if I were nothing more than a fly. But I saw it then, the crack in her composure, the brief flash of anger that came from being challenged without warning. Behind the scenes, the fallout was immediate. I slipped back toward the corridor just as two managers converged near the technical station, voices low and urgent. "They're furious," one said. "They want this fixed now, no delays." "That's not possible," the other replied. "We already stretched it." "They don't care," the first said. "They want results, not explanations." A young staff member hovered nearby, pale. "They're asking us to bypass the secondary check," she said quietly, "just to save time." The words landed heavily. "That's not allowed." Someone whispered. "It's not safe," another added. My pulse quickened, but my voice stayed steady. "Who asked for that?" The young staff member looked at me, then down. "Their liaison," she said. "He said it came straight from them." Of course it did. I pictured the sequence in my mind, the margins already shaved down to nothing. Removing the secondary check wasn't just risky, it was reckless. If something failed, it wouldn't be a minor embarrassment. It could cascade into something far worse, and the blame would never reach the people demanding it. "Have they put that request in writing?" I asked. The staff member shook her head. "No, just verbal. They said we don't have time for paperwork." That told me everything I needed to know. I looked at the managers. "If you do that and something goes wrong, it's on you," I said. "Not them." One of them ran a hand through his hair. "If we don't, they'll have us fired." "They'll try," I said. The other manager studied me. "And what do you suggest?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. This was the line. Once crossed, there would be no pretending I was just a concerned bystander. "You don't bypass the check," I said. "You document the request note, the risk and delay until it's cleared." "They'll explode," the first manager said. "Let them," I replied. "Better an angry client than a preventable failure." Silence settled over the group. The young staff member looked between us, fear written plainly across her face. "They're already watching," she said. "They're looking for someone to blame." "I know," I said. "That's why you don't give them one." The managers exchanged a glance. This wasn't a technical decision anymore. It was a political one. Finally, one of them nodded. "Okay," he said. "We'll hold the line." The relief that washed over the staff was immediate, but it didn't last long. A shadow fell across the corridor entrance. The liaison appeared jaw-tight, eyes scanning the scene. He stopped when he saw me. "There you are," he said. "We need to talk." I followed him a few steps away, far enough that others couldn't hear. "You're causing problems," he said quietly. "They're not happy." "I've noticed," I replied. "They expect compliance," he continued. "This isn't a negotiation." "It is when safety is involved," I said. He leaned closer. "You're overstepping." I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm preventing a mistake." His voice dropped. "Do you know who you're dealing with?" "Yes," I said. "People used to getting their way." He stared at me for a long moment, then smiled thinly. "You should be careful," he said. "People who don't know their place tend to regret it." "I know my place," I replied. "That's the difference." He scoffed and walked away, already dialing his phone. The message was clear. The gloves were off. I returned to the main hall just as another announcement was delayed. The host filled the gap with nervous humor, but the crowd was restless now. Whispers spread. Eyes flicked toward the stage, then toward the family at the center of it all. My sister stood frozen confusion etched across her face. She caught my eye from across the room, her brow furrowing. She moved toward me when she could. "What's happening?" she asked quietly. "Things are being rushed," I said. "And rushed things break." She swallowed. "Are you involved in this?" "Yes," I admitted. Her eyes widened. "Why?" "Because someone has to say no," I replied. She looked torn, fear and trust colliding in her expression. Before she could respond, her future mother-in-law appeared at her side, her smile sharp enough to cut. "We need a moment," she said pointedly, placing a hand on my sister's arm and steering her away. I watched them go, something heavy settling in my stomach. Back in the corridor, the staff moved with grim determination. They were holding the line, but they knew what it meant. Retaliation was coming. It always did. I stood there feeling the weight of the choice I'd made. I could still step back, still let the system crush whoever stood in its way, still retreat into anonymity. But I didn't, because some lines once drawn demanded to be defended. They had tried to break the night quietly. I had just made sure they couldn't ignore the consequences. The consequences of holding the line didn't arrive all at once. They came in small, precise movements like pieces sliding across a board no one had realized was in play. Behind the scenes, the dangerous request never happened. The secondary check stayed in place. The compressed sequence was quietly restored to something workable. The system breathed again, fragile but intact. And people noticed. I saw it in the way staff members straightened when they passed me, in the way questions paused mid-air before finding their way to my ears. A technician glanced at me before confirming a cue. A coordinator nodded once, quick and grateful, before returning to her screen. The machine had accepted the correction. But machines weren't the only things watching. Whispers moved faster than instructions now. I caught fragments as I walked through the corridor, half-sentences, cautious speculation. Who approved that? She said no, and it stuck. That wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't slow down. I didn't speed up. I kept my pace measured, my posture neutral. Authority didn't need to announce itself. It needed to be consistent. Near the technical station, one of the managers intercepted me. He looked tense, but there was something else there too, respect edged with uncertainty. "They're asking questions," he said quietly. "About the delay," I asked. "About you." I met his gaze. "What are you telling them that you're advising operations?" he said. "Nothing more." "That's enough," I replied. He hesitated. "They're not used to being told no. I know." He studied me for a moment longer, then nodded and stepped away. He hadn't asked who I was. He hadn't demanded credentials. That was new. The first real pushback came minutes later. A revised request landed through the liaison, carefully worded this time, wrapped in language meant to sound reasonable. It proposed a partial workaround, a compromise that would technically satisfy the safety requirements while restoring their timeline. On paper, it looked acceptable. In practice, it was a trap. I read through the details, my jaw tightening. If approved, it would put responsibility squarely back on the staff while giving the family plausible deniability. If anything went wrong, they'd claim it wasn't what they asked for. Clever, predictable. I handed the tablet back. "No," I said. The coordinator blinked. "No counter with conditions," I replied. "Documented approval. Full sign-off." "They'll never agree to that," she said. "Then it doesn't move forward," I said. She swallowed. "They're going to escalate." "I expect them to," I said. She nodded slowly and relayed the message. That was when the temperature dropped. The liaison reappeared, his smile gone, replaced by something colder. "You're forcing their hand," he said. "No," I replied. "They're showing it." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You don't have the authority to make demands." I met his eyes. "Authority isn't always about demands." His jaw tightened. "They want to know who you report to." "I don't," I said. For a split second, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then he scoffed. "Everyone reports to someone." "Not everyone," I said. He straightened. "This ends now," he said. "Or it ends badly." I let the words hang there, heavy and empty. For whom, I asked. He didn't answer. He turned and walked away, already dialing his phone. The call he made mattered. I could feel it. Minutes later, a request came through that shouldn't have reached me at all. A system prompt, a confirmation step reserved for senior oversight. It flashed briefly on a monitor near the control desk before the technician froze, eyes widening. I didn't trigger that," she said. "I did." I replied. She looked at me, startled. "You can't—" "It's authorized," I said calmly. "Proceed." Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling. "If I do this without clearance, you have it," I said. "From me." She swallowed hard, then pressed enter. The system accepted the command without protest. Around us, the room went very still. No alarms, no errors. Just a quiet confirmation that something fundamental had shifted. The technician exhaled shakily. "Who are you?" she whispered. I met her gaze. "Someone making sure this doesn't fall on you." That was the moment people understood, even if they didn't have words for it, the kind of understanding that didn't need explanation. The ripple reached the front of the house almost immediately. My sister found me near the edge of the corridor, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "They fixed the issue," she said. "They said it was handled." "It was," I replied. She studied my face, how I considered her question carefully. There were truths that could be spoken and truths that had to wait. "I made sure the right people were listening," I said. Her brow furrowed. "Since when can you do that?" I met her eyes steady and honest. "Since longer than you think." She looked like she wanted to ask more, but footsteps approached from behind her. She turned just as her future mother-in-law appeared, her smile thin and strained. "We're adjusting the schedule," the woman said briskly. "Minor delays." My sister nodded, visibly relieved to have something concrete to hold on to. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." The woman's gaze slid to me, sharp and assessing. "And you," she said. "You seem to be everywhere tonight." "I go where I'm needed," I replied. Her lips pressed together. "We'll talk later." I nodded once. "I'm sure." She walked away, heels clicking with irritation. My sister lingered, her voice low. "They're upset," she said. "I know." "Are you okay?" she asked. I gave her a small smile. "I am." She hesitated, then nodded and returned to the party, leaving me alone with the hum of machinery and the weight of what I'd done. A manager approached, his expression unreadable. "They're digging," he said, "trying to find where you fit." "They won't," I replied. "They might," he said. "They're not used to losing control. I'm not taking it from them," I said. "I'm preventing misuse." He studied me, then sighed. "You know they'll try to sideline you." "They already are," I said. "Then why stay?" I considered that. "Because stepping back now would undo everything." He nodded slowly. "Just be careful." Careful. Another word that carried history. Careful meant quiet. Careful meant invisible. Careful meant safe for everyone but yourself. I watched the system run smoother now, but under strain. I watched the people who mattered move with purpose, the ones who borrowed authority hover uncertainly at the edges. I knew what came next. The family would try to reclaim control openly this time. They would push harder, faster, believing momentum could protect them. They would underestimate how much the board had already changed. I checked my phone again, not for messages, but for confirmation. The signal I'd sent earlier had gone through. The acknowledgement was subtle, almost nothing. Enough. As I turned back toward the corridor, I felt the shift settle into place. The mini reveal had happened not with an announcement, not with a name, but with an outcome. They finally realized I wasn't a problem they could manage, only one they had underestimated, and the real battle was just beginning. The shift came quietly, but once it happened, there was no mistaking it. The room didn't grow louder or more chaotic. It grew cautious. People stopped asking me questions directly. Decisions that had flowed through the corridor minutes earlier now detoured around me. A coordinator who'd been steady all night avoided my eyes as she passed. A technician who'd nodded confidently before now hesitated, waiting for someone else to confirm what we both already knew was correct. Isolation had begun. I recognized it instantly. It was an old tactic. You didn't confront a problem head-on when you weren't sure you could win. You cut it off from oxygen and hoped it suffocated on its own. I walked the length of the corridor and felt the difference with every step. Doors that had been open earlier were now closed. Conversations stopped when I approached. The system was being rewired in real time, not to function better, but to make sure I wasn't part of it. They were testing me. A revised schedule appeared on a wall monitor, flashing briefly before being replaced by another. The changes weren't operational improvements. They were symbolic. My earlier adjustments had been erased, overwritten by something sloppier, riskier. I stopped in front of the screen. "That's not right," a voice said quietly beside me. I turned to see the young staff member from earlier, his face pale but resolute. "They told us to revert," he continued. "Said it came from the top." "Which top?" I asked. He swallowed. "Their top. Of course." "Did they document it?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, just verbal again." I nodded once. "Leave it with me." He hesitated. "They're saying you don't have authority anymore." I met his gaze. "Did they say who does?" He didn't answer because there was no answer to give. I turned back toward the corridor just as two managers emerged from a side room, their expressions tight. They stopped short when they saw me. "We've been instructed to proceed without your input," one of them said, his voice formal. "By whom?" I asked. He glanced at the other manager before answering. "By the family." I let the silence stretch. "That's not a department," I said. He flushed. "They're the clients. And clients don't outrank safety," I replied. The second manager sighed. "Look, we're under pressure. They're threatening to pull support to make calls. They're saying you're interfering for personal reasons." There it was. The smear, quiet, careful, just plausible enough to plant doubt. "I am personally invested," I said, "in making sure no one gets hurt." "That's not how they're framing it," the first manager replied. "Of course not," I said. They shifted uncomfortably. "We're being told to move forward," the second manager added, "without delay." "And if something goes wrong?" I asked. Neither answered. I nodded. "Then this is where I step back," I said. Relief flickered across their faces too quickly for them to hide it. They thought this was a victory. "I'll remove myself from the chain," I continued, "but I won't disappear." Their relief faltered. "What does that mean?" one of them asked. "It means I'll be watching," I said, "and documenting." They exchanged glances. "You're making this worse," the first manager muttered. "No," I replied. "I'm making it honest." I walked away before they could respond. The next blow landed closer to home. I found my sister near the edge of the main hall, her shoulders tense, her smile brittle. She looked relieved when she saw me, then uncertain as she noticed the expressions around us. "They pulled me aside," she said quietly. "Your involvement came up." I didn't interrupt. "They said you were causing delays," she continued, "that you might be doing it because you don't approve of the engagement." I felt the sting of that sharp and precise. "And what did you say?" I asked. She hesitated. "I said I didn't think that was fair," but I prompted gently. "But they made it sound serious," she admitted, "like you were overstepping, like you were going to get someone in trouble." I nodded slowly. "They would say that." Her voice dropped. "Is it true?" I looked at her, really looked at her. The fear beneath her composure wasn't about me. It was about losing the fragile world she'd built around this night. "I'm not doing this to sabotage you," I said. "I'm doing it because what they're asking for is dangerous." She searched my face. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because you wouldn't have been allowed to hear it," I replied. "And because they would have used you to stop me." Her eyes widened slightly. She hadn't considered that. "They said if things go wrong, it'll reflect on our family," she said. I nodded. "It will." "And you're okay with that?" I took a breath. "I'm okay with the truth." She looked away, torn. "I don't know who to believe," she whispered. "You don't have to believe me," I said. "Just watch what happens." She nodded, though I could tell it didn't comfort her. Before she could say more, her future mother-in-law appeared, her hand closing possessively around my sister's arm. "We need you," she said pointedly, her gaze flicking toward me with open hostility. My sister was pulled away without another word. I stood there for a moment, the noise of the party pressing in around me, and felt the full weight of the isolation settle. This was the point they always aimed for. Cut off from allies, cut off from family. Make the problem doubt itself. I didn't. Back in the corridor, the atmosphere had shifted again. People moved quickly, avoiding eye contact. The revised schedule was being implemented, corners cut with grim efficiency. I watched the system strain, saw the margins disappear. They were forcing the moment. I stepped into a small side room and closed the door behind me. For the first time all night, I allowed myself stillness. This was no longer about preventing a single failure. It was about exposing a pattern. I took out my phone and sent a message. Short, precise. It triggered a process I'd hoped not to use tonight, one that would require the opposing side to commit fully to their choices. Once they did, there would be no undoing it. I returned to the corridor just as raised voices echoed from the main hall. The family had made a decision, a public one. They were accelerating the timeline, announcing a change that would lock everything into place. I saw the confidence on their faces as they passed the belief that speed would protect them, that if they moved fast enough, no one could stop them. They were wrong. A coordinator caught my eye from across the room, panic flickering in her expression. "They're doing it," she mouthed. I nodded once. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. They thought forcing the moment would protect them. They didn't realize they'd just stepped into the trap. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The music still played, the lights still glowed, but everything underneath froze like a held breath no one dared release. They had forced the moment. Everyone could feel it. Staff clustered closer to their stations, eyes fixed on screens that updated too quickly. Managers stopped pretending to multitask and simply waited. Even the guests sensed the shift, their conversations thinning out, their laughter softer, uncertain. The system was looking for someone to steady it. And whether they liked it or not, it was looking at me. I stepped away from the corridor and into a small unoccupied office just off the operations floor. The door closed with a soft click behind me, cutting off the noise. The room was spare desk chair, a framed evacuation map on the wall. No windows, no distractions. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to stop moving. I rested my palms on the edge of the desk and breathed in slowly. This was the space between decisions, the narrow strip of time where outcomes were still negotiable. I'd learned to recognize it years ago. Back then, I hadn't understood the cost of silence. The memory came unbidden, sharp, and precise. A different venue, a different event, different people wearing the same confidence. I'd been younger, newly promoted, still believing that competence alone protected you. When the warning signs appeared, compressed timelines, undocumented requests, quiet pressure, I'd spoken up early, too early. They'd smiled, nodded, thanked me for my input, and done exactly what they wanted anyway. When things went wrong, the failure had landed neatly at my feet. I'd been visible, vocal, and expendable. I remembered standing alone in a room not unlike this one, listening as responsibility was reassigned in careful language. No raised voices, no accusations, just a clean transfer of blame. That was the night I learned the difference between authority and power. Authority announced itself. Power waited. I straightened the memory receding as the present reasserted itself. Tonight was different. I hadn't rushed to warn. I hadn't demanded attention. I'd let the pattern reveal itself fully, let the pressure expose who was making decisions and who would pay for them. Now the board was set. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in," I said. The door opened to reveal a woman I hadn't seen before. Older than most of the staff, composed her expression neutral but alert. She closed the door behind her and studied me without preamble. "They're escalating," she said. "I know," I replied. "They're demanding the override be pushed through," she continued. "Immediately." "And you?" I asked. "I'm here to confirm something," she said, "before this goes any further." I waited. She met my gaze. "Do you have standing authority to halt the sequence if necessary?" "Yes," I said. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't ask who I was. She simply nodded once as if a box had been checked. "Then you should," she said, "if they continue." "I will," I replied. She paused at the door. "They won't like it." "They already don't," I said. A corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "Good," she said, and left. The confirmation settled something inside me. I hadn't imagined the shift. The system had recognized the risk even if the people trying to dominate it hadn't. I stepped back into the corridor just as the announcement from the main hall began. My sister's future father-in-law had taken the microphone, his posture rigid with forced confidence. He spoke quickly, his words polished but rushed, announcing a change to the evening's schedule as if it had always been planned this way. It hadn't. I watched the ripple of reactions spread through the room. Confusion, surprise, a few murmurs of approval from people who mistook decisiveness for competence. Behind the scenes, the impact was immediate. "That locks it," a technician whispered, eyes wide. "If we proceed now." "We don't," I said. She turned to me, panic flashing across her face. "They're insisting." "I know," I said. "Pause the sequence." Her fingers hovered over the controls. "I need authorization." I nodded toward the monitor. "You have it. She swallowed hard, then executed the command. The system responded instantly, the forced acceleration grinding to a halt. A buffer reappeared on the screen, restoring space, where there had been none seconds earlier. In the main hall, the microphone cut out mid-sentence. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The man froze, blinking in disbelief, as the sound system went silent. His wife leaned toward him, whispering urgently, her composure cracking. Voices rose. Someone gestured angrily toward the back of the room. And then the question started. "What's happening? Is there a problem? Who stopped it?" I stepped forward, not onto the stage, but into the open space just behind it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "The sequence has been paused," I said clearly, "until it's safe to proceed." The man spun toward me, his face flushing. "You can't do that." "I already did," I replied. "This is our event," his wife snapped. "You don't have the authority I do," I said. The word landed with more force than I expected, not because of volume, but because of certainty. A few heads turned toward me, staff members straightened. Someone near the sound booth nodded almost imperceptibly. The woman stared at me, searching for something to push against. "Who are you?" she demanded. I held her gaze. "Someone who's responsible for what happens next." Silence followed, heavy and unmistakable. My sister stood frozen near the front, her hands clenched together. Our eyes met. Confusion warred with dawning understanding in her expression. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly, when the room had grown quiet enough for her voice to carry. I didn't look away. "Because if I had, you wouldn't have been allowed to hear it." She swallowed. "And now," I said gently, "you get the truth." The woman laughed sharply. "This is outrageous." "It's necessary," I replied. "Your requests tonight have repeatedly bypassed safeguards. That stops now." "You're accusing us," the man said. "I'm documenting," I said. "There's a difference." Behind me, I felt the presence of others, people who hadn't intervened before, people who now understood they didn't have to. The system was no longer leaning forward blindly. It was braced. The woman took a step back, then another. "You're ruining this," she said, her voice tight. I shook my head. "You did," I said quietly, "by trying to control something you don't understand." A murmur rippled through the guests. Not outrage. Recognition. My sister moved closer to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you going to stop it?" I looked at her. Really looked at her. "No," I said. "I'm going to make sure it happens the right way." She nodded slowly, something in her shoulders easing for the first time all night. The man opened his mouth to argue again, but no sound came out. Whatever authority he thought he held had dissolved in the pause exposed by the refusal that didn't bend. Around us, people began to reposition themselves, physically, socially. Conversation shifted. Attention drifted away from the couple at the center and toward the edges, toward the mechanisms that actually mattered. I felt it then, the quiet click of inevitability. They were still trying to win the night. I was preparing to end the game. Control doesn't vanish all at once. It slips. I felt it the moment I stepped back into the main hall. The air had changed thinner, somehow less obedient. Conversations resumed, but without the same confidence. People laughed, but their eyes kept drifting toward the stage, toward the corners of the room where decisions were no longer landing cleanly. The family at the center of the night still stood where they had before, dressed impeccably, smiling with effort, but the rhythm around them had broken. Requests took longer to fulfill. Staff no longer moved instinctively at their gestures. When something needed confirmation, eyes shifted elsewhere. Not to me directly. Not yet. But close. A server approached the bar, hesitated, then leaned toward a manager instead of the groom's mother. The manager nodded once before giving instructions. It was a small thing, almost nothing. But small things were how collapses began. I stayed where I was, near the edge of the room, visible but unannounced. I didn't speak. I didn't move toward the center. I let the imbalance reveal itself. A guest near me whispered to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice enough. "Did you notice," she said, "they don't seem to be running things anymore?" Her companion frowned. "Who is then?" She shrugged. "No idea. But something's off." Across the room, the groom's father tried to initiate another announcement. He leaned toward the microphone, tapped it once, then twice. Nothing happened. A technician approached, murmured something, and gestured for him to wait. He didn't like that. "I need this addressed now," he said sharply. The technician shook his head. "I'm waiting for confirmation." From whom the man demanded. The technician glanced past him, eyes flicking toward the operations desk, then away. "From operations," he said. That should have been routine. Instead, it landed like a slap. The groom's father opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He looked around, searching for support for someone to reinforce the authority he was used to wielding. His wife stepped forward, lips tight. "This is unacceptable," she said. "We've been patient." A manager approached, his tone measured. "We're resolving a sequencing issue," he said. "It won't take long." "You don't understand," she snapped. "This is not a request." The manager didn't flinch. "I understand," he said, "but we're not proceeding until it's cleared." Silence followed, not the respectful kind, the kind that exposed uncertainty. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. One excused herself to the restroom. Another pretended to check his phone and drifted away. Social gravity was already pulling people towards safer ground. I watched the groom's parents retreat slightly, huddling together, voices low and urgent. The confidence had drained from their posture, replaced by something brittle. They hadn't prepared for resistance. They'd prepared for admiration. Behind them, my sister stood frozen, caught between loyalty and dawning clarity. She looked smaller now, not because she'd lost stature, but because the illusion around her was collapsing faster than she could process it. I moved closer, stopping a few feet away. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly. She nodded, but it was automatic. Her eyes stayed fixed on her future in-laws. "They're arguing," she said. "I know," I replied. "They've never argued like this," she whispered. "Not in public." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The truth was unfolding on its own. A sudden burst of laughter cut through the tension from the far side of the room, too loud, too abrupt. Someone was trying to reclaim normalcy by force. It didn't work. The sound fell flat, drawing more attention to what everyone was avoiding. A woman near the front leaned toward her husband. "I thought they owned this place," she murmured. "So did I," he replied. Apparently not. That was the first crack they couldn't cover. The groom's mother turned sharply, scanning the room, her gaze landing on me. Our eyes locked. For a moment there was no anger there, just calculation. The frantic assessment of someone realizing the rules had changed mid-game. She broke eye contact first. Minutes later, the second fracture came. A decision was announced, firm, public, delivered with the tone of finality. The groom's father declared that the evening would proceed immediately, adjustments or not. He smiled tightly, daring the system to defy him. It did. Nothing moved. No lights shifted. No cue followed. The technician at the booth didn't look up. The manager didn't respond. The silence stretched merciless. "Why isn't it happening?" The groom's father snapped. The manager stepped forward. "Because we don't have clearance," he said evenly. From whom the man demanded again, louder this time. The manager glanced briefly in my direction before answering. "From oversight." That was all it took. A murmur rippled through the room, no longer subtle. People exchanged looks. Some stepped back physically, distancing themselves from the center of the conflict. Others leaned in, hungry for the reveal. The groom's mother's face flushed. "This is absurd," she said. "We've been assured you were assured incorrectly," the manager replied. Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she had no one to override. No shortcut. No borrowed power left to spend. I felt eyes on me now, openly curious. Someone near the bar tilted their head, studying me. A woman I didn't recognize whispered my description to her friend. I hadn't said anything new, I hadn't claimed anything, but my position had shifted. I wasn't the center, I was the reference point. My sister turned to me slowly. "You knew this would happen," she said. "Yes," I replied. She swallowed. "Is it going to get worse?" I considered the question honestly. "For them," I said. "Yes." Her shoulders sagged, grief and relief colliding. "I feel like I'm watching strangers," she whispered. "You are," I said gently. "So am I." Across the room, the groom stood silent, eyes darting between his parents and the staff. He looked young in that moment, stripped of the confidence he'd borrowed from their certainty. He didn't speak. He didn't defend them. That silence spoke volumes. The groom's parents retreated again, this time toward a corner, voices low and sharp. I didn't need to hear the words to understand the panic underneath them. Their options were closing. Every path out of this room led through accountability. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only inevitability. A coordinator approached me, voice barely audible. "They're asking if they can regroup," she said. "For what purpose?" I asked. She hesitated. "To figure out how to proceed." I nodded. "Tell them they can wait," I said. "But nothing moves without clearance." She nodded and hurried off. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve shouting or spectacle. It was quieter than that, more devastating. People stopped deferring, stopped pretending, stopped believing. The family that had entered the night wrapped in confidence now stood isolated, their power stripped down to what it had always been, performance without foundation. I stayed where I was, letting the room adjust around the truth. They were still standing, but the ground beneath them was already gone. The moment could no longer be delayed. The guests had been drawn closer to the stage by confusion, as much as curiosity, their conversations thinning until the room felt strangely hollow. Glasses were still raised, smiles still fixed, but the night had lost its script. Everyone sensed it. Something was about to be decided, whether anyone was ready or not. The groom's father stepped forward again, jaw set, shoulders squared, as if posture alone could restore what had slipped away. He reached for the microphone with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We're going to continue," he announced, his voice amplified and brittle. "There have been misunderstandings, but they've been resolved. Let's move forward." It was his last attempt to seize the night by force. For a few seconds, nothing happened. No lights shifted. No music swelled. The technicians remained still. The manager near the stage didn't nod or gesture. He simply waited. The silence grew heavy enough to press against the walls. A man in a dark suit stepped out from the side of the room, then someone most guests hadn't noticed all evening. He didn't raise his voice or demand attention. He didn't need to. He spoke quietly to the technician, handed over a document, and nodded once. The microphone went dead. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. "What is this?" The groom's mother demanded, her composure finally cracking. "Who authorized that?" The man turned slightly, his expression unreadable. "Oversight," he said. Before she could respond, I stepped forward. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I moved into the open space between the stage and the crowd and stopped there where everyone could see me without my needing to say a word. The room stilled. I felt my sister's eyes on me, wide and searching. I felt my parents' confusion, their sudden awareness that something far larger than embarrassment was unfolding. I felt the groom's parents stiffen, recognition dawning too late. "I did," I said. My voice carried without effort. A dozen reactions collided at once, gasps, whispers, sharp intakes of breath. The groom's father turned toward me, disbelief written across his face. "You," he said. "You have no—" I stopped it. I continued calmly. "Because what you were about to force through violated operational safeguards." His face reddened. "This is outrageous." "It's documented," I replied, repeatedly. The groom's mother laughed sharply, the sound edged with panic. "Who do you think you are?" I met her gaze steady and unflinching. "I'm the person responsible for this venue's operations tonight," I said. "And beyond tonight." The words settled like a dropped weight. People leaned forward now, no longer pretending disinterest. The murmurs grew louder, less polite. Someone near the bar whispered my name, asking someone else if they'd heard it before. "You're lying," the groom's father said, but his voice lacked conviction. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. I turned slightly and nodded toward the man in the dark suit. He stepped forward and spoke clearly without drama. "She isn't." That was all it took. The groom's parents stared at him, then at me, their confidence unraveling in real time. The borrowed authority they'd worn so comfortably all evening collapsed under the weight of verification. "I've been silent tonight by choice," I said, my voice even. I wanted to see how decisions were made when no one thought they were being watched. My sister took a step toward me, her face pale. "You own," she began. "I oversee this organization," I said, gently turning to her, "including this venue." Her breath caught. "You didn't tell me. I didn't want you caught between loyalty and truth," I replied. "You deserve the night you were promised, not the one they tried to control." The groom's mother shook her head, backing away, as if the distance might undo what was happening. "This is a setup," she said. "You planned this." "No," I said. "I prevented it." I faced the room again, not seeking approval, not demanding attention. Throughout the evening, I continued. There were repeated attempts to bypass safety checks, compress timelines, and override staff judgment. Each request was verbal. Each one was denied documentation. I paused, letting the words sink in. "I have records," I said. "Times, names, decisions." The groom's father opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to argue. Denial required a foundation he no longer had. Around us, the social shift was immediate and brutal. Guests who'd been orbiting the groom's parents drifted away, suddenly absorbed in their phones or conversations elsewhere. The laughter that returned was low and awkward relief mixed with fascination. "This isn't personal," I said. "It's structural." The groom's mother's voice trembled. "You humiliated us." I shook my head. "You exposed yourselves." The groom stood frozen, his eyes darting between his parents and my sister. Finally he spoke, his voice barely audible. "You said everything was handled." She turned on him, fury flashing. "Not now!" But it was already too late. I looked at my sister. "I won't make your decision for you," I said softly. "But you should know what kind of people demand obedience instead of understanding." She swallowed, her eyes shining. "I see it," she said. That admission cut deeper than any accusation. The man in the dark suit cleared his throat. "For clarity," he said, addressing the room, "operations will proceed once all safeguards are restored. Any further interference will be documented." The groom's parents stood rigid, isolated by the truth pressing in from all sides. Their power hadn't been taken. It had evaporated. I didn't look at them again. Instead, I addressed the staff. "You did the right thing," I said. "All of you." Relief washed over their faces, visible and immediate. Then I turned back to the room one last time. "The night can continue," I said. "But not like this." The music returned slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether it was allowed to exist again. Conversations resumed, reshaped by what everyone had just witnessed. The groom's parents were no longer at the center. They were no longer anything. My sister stood beside me, silent but steady. My parents hovered nearby, stunned, their understanding catching up to reality. The explosion had passed. What remained was truth, and nothing in that room would ever look the same again. The room after the storm felt unfamiliar, like a place that had been emptied of its illusions and hadn't yet decided what to become. The music was gone. The lights remained, but dimmer now, softer, no longer performing. Guests drifted in small clusters, speaking in low voices, their excitement replaced by something closer to awe or discomfort. No one stood at the center anymore. There was no center left. The groom's parents lingered near the edge of the hall, their backs stiff, their faces pale with a kind of disbelief that hadn't yet turned into anger or grief. They looked smaller without an audience, ordinary. People passed them without stopping. That absence was louder than any confrontation. Behind the scenes, the system moved on without ceremony. Documentation requests were filed, reports were opened. Staff members who had spent the night bracing for fallout now spoke with cautious relief, their voices steadier, their movements less frantic. I didn't direct any of it. I didn't need to. Once a system remembers how it's supposed to function, it doesn't ask permission to correct itself. A coordinator approached me quietly, her posture still tense, but no longer fearful. "We've initiated the review," she said. "Temporary suspensions, internal checks." I nodded. "Good. They asked if you wanted to sit in," she added. "No," I said. "They know what to do." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said before returning to her work. I watched her go, feeling the weight of what had shifted. This wasn't victory, it was restoration, the kind that didn't make headlines, but changed everything that followed. Near the bar, a few guests gathered their coats early, murmuring polite excuses. Others stayed lingering out of curiosity or loyalty to my sister. But the mood had changed irrevocably. The night would be remembered not for champagne or speeches, but for the moment something false had been stripped away. My parents approached me slowly, as if unsure whether I would welcome them. My mother spoke first. "We didn't know," she said, her voice unsteady. "I know," I replied. My father cleared his throat. We thought it was better not to make waves." I looked at them, really looked at them. They weren't weak. They were tired. Tired of fighting battles they didn't believe they could win. Sometimes I said gently, "Not making waves costs more." They nodded, both of them, the understanding settling in quietly. There were no apologies, no dramatic confessions, just a shared acknowledgement of something long avoided. They stepped back, giving me space, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was disappointing them by existing fully. My sister stood near the stage alone. I crossed the room slowly, aware of the way people watched, without staring, their curiosity restrained by respect. When I reached her, she turned toward me, her eyes red but steady. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything," I replied. She exhaled a shaky sound. "I feel like I've been pretending for so long that I forgot how heavy it was." I nodded. Pretending always gets heavier. She looked toward where her fiancé stood a few feet away, silent, uncertain. "They're not who I thought they were," she said. "No," I agreed. "But now you know." She swallowed. "I chose them. I chose this." "Yes," I said, "you did. And now you get to choose again." She studied my face, searching for judgment. She didn't find it. "I was afraid," she said quietly. "Afraid that if I didn't fit into their world, I'd lose everything." I reached for her hand. "You don't lose yourself to belong," I said. "If you do, it was never belonging." Tears slid down her cheeks unchecked. She didn't wipe them away. For the first time that night, she wasn't performing. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for pushing you aside, for letting them treat you like you didn't matter." I squeezed her hand. "You were surviving," I said. "I understand that." She nodded, breathing unevenly, then leaned into me briefly. Not dramatically, just enough to feel real. Behind us, raised voices cut through the quiet. The groom's parents were being asked to step aside politely but firmly. There was no shouting, no scene, just instructions and consequences delivered without emotion. The groom stood nearby, his hands clenched, his expression hollow. For a moment, the groom's mother looked at me. There was no fury left in her eyes, only fear. I didn't look away. She turned, shoulders slumping, and followed the manager toward a private area. That was the end of it. Not with triumph, not with revenge, just with truth catching up. Later, when the room had emptied further and the staff began dismantling what remained of the evening, I stood alone near the entrance. The same doors where I'd been redirected hours earlier now stood open unattended. I stepped outside into the cool night air and let it settle against my skin. I thought about how easily this could have gone another way, how close we'd come to an outcome where silence won and harm followed quietly behind it. How often that happened in rooms like this, in families like mine. Power didn't always corrupt. Sometimes it just revealed. I chose not to press further, not to dismantle lives beyond what accountability required. There would be consequences. There always were. But I wasn't interested in destruction for its own sake. Stopping at the line mattered. I returned inside just as my sister approached again, calmer now. "What happens next?" she asked. "That depends on you," I said. "But you won't be alone." She nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "I believe that." As the last guests departed and the staff finished their work, the building settled into stillness. No applause marked the end. No announcement closed the night. Only responsibility remained. And for the first time in a long while, I was at peace with that. Time didn't rush back in after that night. It returned carefully, as if testing whether the space it re-entered was safe. Weeks passed, then more. The story of the engagement party faded from conversation, replaced by newer distractions, newer dramas. That was how it always worked. Public memory was short, consequences less so. I stood one morning in a quiet office overlooking a city that hadn't changed at all. Traffic moved, phones rang, meetings began and ended on schedule. From the outside, nothing about my life looked different, but everything was. The venue ran smoothly now. Not perfectly, nothing ever did, but honestly. Requests were documented, timelines respected. People asked questions without fear of punishment. I noticed it most in the smallest details: a technician who pushed back politely and wasn't overruled, a junior coordinator whose concern was taken seriously instead of dismissed. Power, when used correctly, didn't make noise. It made space. I thought about that night more often than I expected. Not with regret, with clarity. For years I'd believed silence was protection, that if I stayed out of sight, stayed useful but unremarkable, I could avoid becoming a target. And in many ways that had worked. I'd built systems quietly influence carefully authority that didn't need to be announced. But silence had a cost. It let other people decide what was acceptable. It let cruelty hide behind etiquette. It let incompetence wear confidence like armor. That night had forced me to confront something I'd avoided for a long time, knowing when silence stopped being strategic and started being complicity. My sister and I talked more after everything settled. Not every day. Not with grand gestures. Just honest conversations, sometimes awkward, sometimes raw. She had ended the engagement. Not dramatically, not in public. She told me later it had been one of the hardest conversations of her life, not because she still loved him, but because she had to admit how much of herself she'd abandoned to make it work. I kept telling myself it was temporary, she said once, sitting across from me at a small cafe, that I'd get back to myself later. I nodded. Later has a way of disappearing. She smiled sadly. I know. She didn't rebuild overnight. Neither of us did. Trust didn't snap back into place just because the truth had been exposed. But something quieter replaced it: mutual respect. The kind that didn't require agreement, only honesty. Our parents adjusted too. Slowly, carefully. They never said the words "we were wrong" out loud, but they didn't have to. They asked questions they'd never asked before. They listened without rushing to smooth things over. For them, that was everything. One afternoon, months later, I walked through the same entrance where the security guard had redirected me that night. The doors opened automatically now, indifferent to who approached them. No one stopped me. No one looked twice. I passed through the lobby at an unremarkable hour, the space stripped of glamour and performance. Just a building doing its job. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. Power, I'd learned, wasn't about proving people wrong. It was about making sure fewer people got hurt when others tried to be right at any cost. I had no interest in becoming the kind of person who dominated rooms for sport. I'd seen where that led. I wanted systems that held even when no one was watching, families that didn't require silence to stay together, choices that didn't demand self-erasure as the price of belonging. If there was a lesson in all of this, it wasn't about revenge. It was about timing, about knowing when to wait and when to step forward. Because being underestimated only mattered if you believed the estimate. I often think about the people who were working behind the scenes that night, the ones who nearly carried the blame for decisions they didn't make. Some of them stayed. Some moved on. A few reached out later quietly to say thank you, not for saving them, but for reminding them that saying no was allowed. That mattered to me more than any apology ever could. Life moved forward as it always does. New events replaced old ones, new challenges surfaced, but something fundamental had shifted not just in my world, but in me. I was no longer interested in shrinking to keep other people comfortable. Not loudly, not angrily, just permanently. And maybe that's the part of this story that stays with you. Not the confrontation, not the reveal, but the moment you realize that silence is only powerful when it's chosen, and that your voice used at the right time can change the shape of an entire room. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside because you didn't fit someone else's version of who you should be, you're not alone. If you've ever stayed silent longer than you should have because speaking up felt too risky, too disruptive, too expensive, someone else understands that weight. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had a moment where staying quiet felt safer, but speaking up changed everything? Or maybe you're still waiting for that moment. Share your story in the comments. I read them, I think about them, and they remind me why telling these stories matters. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause or reflect, consider staying with the channel. There are more stories like this about family hidden power and the quiet moments when truth finally steps into the light. You're always welcome here.